are viewing this figure, they're certainly viewing it with caution.
Hello, I'm Claudia Hammond. With much of the world in lockdown, you are no doubt hearing a lot about the coronavirus. And you might also be wondering, how come and what if? So every 2 weeks in The Evidence on the BBC World Service, we have a panel of scientists and other experts who've been involved in trying to stop the spread of the virus or in helping us to cope with it.
But it's incredibly important that people understand that the virus can still stick to the outside of this mask. In fact, there was some recent research that showed viruses can actually survive for up to a week on the surface of surgical masks. So if you're taking those off incorrectly, if you're touching them with your hands and not washing your hands, or if you're reusing these masks often, then you could actually be putting yourself at more risk of infecting yourself.
I'm hoping that many of my questions will be the ones you have in your minds too, but we're also putting some of your specific questions to our panel. So do join me for The Evidence after the BBC News.
Hello, I'm Justine Green with the BBC News. A British Cabinet Minister has insisted that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains in charge despite having been admitted to hospital with persistent symptoms of coronavirus. The Housing Minister Robert Jenrick said Mr Johnson was doing well and would be kept regularly updated. Mr Jenrick also said he expects the Prime Minister to be out of hospital soon.
I know for him personally it will be very frustrating that he's had to go to hospital to have these tests, and he'll want to be back in number 10, leading to the front-footed way. But he remains in charge of the government. He will be updated regularly in hospital, as he has been whilst he's been self-isolating. The Prime Minister does remain in charge of the government, and it's worth underlining that going to hospital was a precautionary step. He's undergoing some routine tests on the advice of his doctor. This isn't an emergency admission, and so I certainly expect that he'll be back at number 10 shortly.
The number of new coronavirus cases in South Korea has fallen below 50 for the first time since the outbreak peaked there in February. 47 new infections were reported on Monday. Laura Bicker reports.
The last 2 weeks, over 50% of all the new cases being reported have actually been international arrivals, so people arriving back from either the US or from Europe. So when it comes to how people here are viewing this figure, they're certainly viewing it with cautious optimism. But the message from the government remains the same. They want this concerted effort over the next 2 weeks of so-called social distancing, because they want to keep the daily figure under 50 if they can.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged governments to make the prevention of violence against women a key part of their response to the pandemic. Mr Guterres said restrictions on movement essential to suppressing COVID-19 could trap women with abusive partners. He outlined what government should be doing.
Increasing investment in online services and civil society organizations. Making sure judicial systems continue to prosecute abusers. Setting up emergency warning systems in pharmacies and groceries. Declaring shelters as essential services. And creating safe ways for women to seek support without alerting their abusers.
Children in parts of Japan have returned to school for the first time in a month, while other schools remain closed amid conflicting views on how to return to normal while limiting the virus. In Tokyo, the number of virus cases has doubled over the past week to more than 1,000. Officials there say the majority of cases can't be traced. Security sources in southern Iraq say several rockets have landed near the area in which foreign oil firms and state-run companies operate. No casualties or damage have been reported at the site, which is west of the city of Basra. You're listening to World News from the BBC. Singapore has quarantined 20,000 migrant workers for 14 days in an attempt to control the coronavirus. The workers, who are mainly South Asian men employed in the construction business, have been asked to stay in their dormitories. Global oil prices have been volatile in trading today after talks intended to restore stability to the market were postponed. The price of Brent crude fell 12% to just over $30 a barrel, but subsequently recovered some of the losses. Andrew Walker reports.
Sales of oil have fallen sharply as the global health crisis has unfolded. Demand for transport fuels, which are predominantly made from crude oil, has been hit very hard indeed. At the same time, traders have been watching for signs that the big producers, in particular Russia and Saudi Arabia, might seek to support the price by agreeing to restrict production. An earlier attempt failed, but President Trump said last week a deal between the two was close. But news that discussions planned for today had been postponed sent prices sharply lower. Some of the ground has been regained, however, as traders still see the possibility of an agreement later this week.
New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has said the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy will both be considered essential workers during the coronavirus lockdown. Speaking to the children of New Zealand, Ms Ardern confirmed that both characters will be exempt from household restrictions and warned that they might have difficulty making it to every home this year. Scientists have for the first time been able to work out the age of the world's biggest fish, whale sharks, thanks to an isotope produced by nuclear tests during the Cold War. They've established that they can live up to 100 years. The whale sharks lack the bony structures that are usually used to confirm the age of fish. Instead, researchers checked the remains of two of the creatures for a carbon isotope, which was produced during atom bomb tests in the 1950s and 60s. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to The Evidence from the BBC World Service. I'm Claudia Hammond, and every 2 weeks we're spending almost an hour discussing the best evidence we have about the coronavirus and its impact on the world. This show is produced in collaboration with Wellcome Collection, and we broadcast in front of audiences in Hong Kong, Vietnam and South Africa. But now, of course, for safety, each of our panel of experts is in their own homes wherever they live in the world, and we have questions which some of you have sent in. Now, this is a chance for us to look in depth at a virus that is causing a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety, and to get to the facts as we know them. Now, the world is changing very fast, and approaches to public health that were considered unthinkable in many parts of the world are now commonplace, such as closing schools, airports, shops and public transport, and demanding that people stay indoors. Meanwhile, hospitals are being built in record time, but many existing hospitals are overwhelmed. Later on, we'll hear about the psychological impact on medical staff in Italy who are witnessing situations they never thought they would see. And why have so many parts of the world not yet put into place the testing which the WHO has said is so crucial in dealing with this outbreak? Now, in this week's evidence, we want to look at what we know about the virus and the immune system, why it can cause mild or even no symptoms in some people, and yet is so very dangerous for others. And as more people become infected, is the stigma around the disease changing? Now, joining me this week are Professor Vivek Jha, the Executive Director of the George Institute for Global Health, India, Dr. Lindsay Broadbent, virologist at Queen's University Belfast, and Christos Linteris, a medical anthropologist from St Andrews University. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Now, let's start by talking about lockdowns. Now, the exact rules vary in different countries, but it is extraordinary to think that now more than 3 billion people around the world are now largely confined to their homes, with Nigeria, Russia, South Africa and India some of the most recent countries to take this action. Now, Vivek, the lockdown in India happened so fast that President Modi has even apologised for the harshness of the lockdown and the impact on poorer people in particular. Some have called it a new humanitarian crisis. What has happened in India, and could India have handled it differently, do you think?
As you notice, here in India, we had the lockdown come pretty fast. It was announced at 8 o'clock in the evening, and the lockdown went into effect at midnight. And so people really had no time to prepare. I guess the reason for this was apparently to avoid panic and to prevent people from trying to go to the shops and start holding supplies. But in effect, what it did to people who work in unorganized sectors, especially rural migrants who come to cities, suddenly they were not only out of a job, but they didn't have any place to live in. Then they didn't have any food to eat. And so they had no way but to try to find their way home. They didn't have any assistance coming their way from the authorities. And we've heard stories of people suffering severe severe hardships. Sometimes when they reached their villages or their towns, they were not allowed to enter the boundary because they were thought to have come from potentially COVID-infected area, leading to additional hardships that they suffered. So this is indeed a big humanitarian crisis, potentially being compared to the big migration that took place at the time of India's independence, when India, at that time, the British India was divided into India and Pakistan, and millions of people migrated from one part of India to another. In addition to that, there have been hardships to other people with other pre-existing chronic diseases. Suddenly, they are unable to access healthcare, which is causing big trouble to all of these people.
So it can result in very harsh situations, and of course the idea is to stop the transmission of the virus. Lindsay, it can take a while, can't it, before a lockdown affects what we actually see happening. How soon after a country has imposed these sorts of restrictions do you expect to see a difference in the transmission of the virus?
It will really take 2 to 3 weeks to see any difference. The incubation period of this virus is anywhere between 2 days and 2 weeks, with an average of about 5 days. So a lot of the people that are in lockdown now, in countries that have only established lockdown, may have been infected before those measures were put in place. So as I said, it will take 2 to 3 weeks post-lockdown to see those numbers start to decrease.
And of course, as some countries are going into lockdown, others, like China, are gradually coming out of isolation. Now, Christos, you've worked extensively in China. What are you hearing about how people are reacting to the lifting of the quite severe restrictions there?
As you know, information from China is rather controlled, so it's difficult to know exactly what's happening while not being on the ground. From what we hear, there has been a gradual lifting in several regions. We hear that restrictions in Wuhan will be lifted on April the 8th. Now, this is not a strategy without a risk, because, as you will remember, the Wuhan lockdown was imposed on the 23rd of January, and one of the reasons this happened then was because this was close to the beginning of the celebration of the Chinese New Year, which signals perhaps the biggest internal migration across the globe. So the lockdown of Wuhan was not just about Wuhan, it was about a much broader flow of population across China. Now, on April 4th, we have another major festival in China. It's not one that sees as a great a movement of people as the New Year, but it does see quite a few people moving around. That's the Qingming festival, which is when people go and visit their ancestors' graves. Very important festival. So this gradual lifting of measures before the Qingming festival is quite a challenge, I think, for China. But it is also something which presumably allow people to go and venerate their ancestors' graves, which is something of great symbolic significance at the moment, especially given how many people have died.
And of course, the countries that are beginning their lockdowns will be looking very carefully to see what happens in China as people emerge from theirs. And I want to come back to India for a moment. Vivek, we've heard how the lockdown was imposed at very short notice, but do we know how many cases of COVID-19 there are in the country?
The number of COVID-19 cases is increasing now, and almost every day the number is rising more than the previous day. So the number of cases is rising rapidly. There are a few hotspots that have been identified, especially one in which there was a large religious congregation in New Delhi, in which we had visitors coming from many countries, and they stayed there for several days, cramped several hundred in a very small mosque, and then they dispersed to various locations in the country, and it appears that there was a coronavirus outbreak seeded by someone or some people who came to that religious gathering.
How well prepared is India to deal with some of the basics, such as the advice we've all been having to wash your hands very thoroughly and to wash them for long enough?
So washing hands is a luxury for a large proportion of Indian population who do not have access to running water, do not have access to soap. India has great diversity in its population, so people who are rich and people who are in the middle class are able to observe all these admonitions that have been given, but people who belong to poor communities, such as the landless laborers and the migrants who are at this time walking from one place to another, clearly do not have access to these facilities. So for them to be able to observe any kind of hand washing is simply asking for too much.
And Lindsay, how much difference does it make if you can't wash your hands easily? How quickly can the virus replicate on your skin and move to infect you?
Yes, the virus can survive on your hands for a while, and if you then touch your face, that is the main route of transmission. However, in countries that don't have access to the type of cleaning facilities and soap and clean running water that are needed, social distancing certainly plays an incredibly important role in those countries.
And Vivek, how difficult is that sort of social distancing going to be in India? If people live in cramped conditions or don't have a home, how is that going to be possible in India?
The simple answer is that it is not going to be possible. India is home to very large slums where people live jowl by jowl in a small room. And again, these people who are moving right now from one place to another, they are sometimes being boarded in buses in large numbers. So clearly these people are not able to observe social distancing.
So Lindsay, does the severity of a person's symptoms depend on how much virus gets into their body? So if they are packed somewhere where there are lots of people who may already have infections, does that put them at more risk? Is that why medical staff, for example, are at more risk?
There is a lot of research being done in this area at the minute. The research isn't certain whether the amount of virus that initially infects a person correlates with the severity, but as you mentioned, that could be one reason why healthcare workers seem to be at such higher risk. But what we do know is that the viral load that a person is secreting does correlate with how severe their symptoms will be.
And there are some reports, Lindsay, of people getting ill, then thinking they're a bit better, and then getting much worse again. Do we know why the virus can act like that?
You're quite right. It seems to be that people seem to get mild symptoms, they feel better for a few days, and that's when the breathing difficulties start. And this is possibly due to the immune response of the body, that the initial symptoms are caused by that initial infection, the upper respiratory tract infection. And then if that isn't cleared effectively, that's when you go on to develop some more severe symptoms, which are actually driven by the body's own immune response and not actually by the virus itself.
And that's interesting because that fits in with a question from Manu Herbstein, who's from Accra in Ghana. And he says, what motivates viruses? If COVID-19 virus were to infect him, what would the virus gain by infecting somebody so badly that it killed them? What does the virus actually want here?
So viruses themselves aren't actually alive. They don't really have an ability to think or drive what their end purpose is. All they do is replicate. So a good virus is able to replicate over and over again and produce lots more viruses. They do not want to kill their host. A virus that kills its host is actually an incredibly bad virus. The virus wants the host to survive, and the longer they survive, the more progeny virus that they will produce.
So it sounds as though the most severe symptoms of all are caused by the body's reaction to the virus rather than the virus itself.
Yes, it's an active immune response. This is why it varies so much between people, because people's immune responses are incredibly different, and that's down to mostly your genetics, your lifestyle, environmental factors. They can all influence how your immune system responds to any pathogen, including this virus, and that varies greatly, and that's one of the avenues of research and treatment options at the minute, to target the actual immune response as opposed to targeting the virus itself.
So what sorts of lifestyle actions could be helpful?
Really a healthy, varied diet, plenty of sleep, drinking plenty, not smoking, really those general everyday things that you hear about to lead a healthy life, make your immune system be as good as they can.
And we'll talk more in the second part of the programme about how to find treatments for COVID-19. But does this way that the immune system behaves, could that give us a clue to finding treatments? Is it about trying to get the immune system to stop misbehaving, if you like?
Absolutely. And the best treatment, I think, will be a two-pronged attack. One is to limit the amount of virus in a person's body and to get rid of that virus. And then, along with that, to limit the immune response and dampen down the immune response from that infection. And if we can do both of those at the same time, then we could really find a fantastic treatment for COVID-19.
And I have some more listener questions I want to put to you. Vivek, let me ask you this one. David Panone from Seattle in the can't remember anything like this that has disrupted so much of the world before. Why has COVID-19 become more serious than, say, the SARS or MERS outbreaks that we saw in the past?
That's the question that everyone is asking right now. Even though these viruses are more dangerous in terms of their lethality, it's COVID which actually is much more contagious compared to these two other viruses. And so it's going from person to person very quickly. It also has a relatively longer incubation period, which allows an asymptomatic person to be able to transmit this infection to other people without everyone realizing that there are asymptomatic people who are sharing this virus amongst them.
Christos, would you compare this outbreak to any other outbreaks or huge disruptions to the world in the past?
As far as China goes, this is definitely comparable to SARS. Extensive lockdowns did happen in China during SARS in 2003. So anyone who is an adult today, this would be their second experience in many cases of a lockdown.
And as a medical anthropologist, you've looked at how the media has represented different epidemics historically. I mean, nowadays there's this image of the coronavirus, the actual virus itself, that is used all the time. Is that kind of image helpful, do you think?
Well, I think this is a staple of representations of epidemics as far back as the third plague epidemic in 1894. It is, I think, largely symbolic, largely meant to connote that science is in control of the situation, which is a good thing, I think.
And I guess the other thing we see in many countries in TV and newspaper reports are, at the moment, pictures of empty streets and people's in masks, doctors in protective gear and hospitals in disarray. Could there be a different way, do you think, of portraying what's going on that could help people understand better what's happening?
I think what would be welcome would be to replace these stereotypical images, which again very much repeat the tropes developed at the beginning of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century under very colonial conditions, and replace these images of every epidemic since the beginning of the 20th century with images which are more community-driven. What we need is more images from the ground, from the people who are going through this. And these images do exist on social media, but they're not necessarily the ones that are reproduced by the media.
What kind of things would you show then?
Well, you could have pictures from home. As you say, there has never been so many people in confinement. So the most unprecedented characteristic of this pandemic is these great numbers of people having to stay at home.
And there have been cases in various countries around the world where people are filming themselves in hospitals with their phones to try to warn others about what might happen, to try to get others to stay safe. Is that a good thing?
Well, that's an interesting phenomenon. It raises interesting questions of medical ethics, because of course when you're filming patients, you don't necessarily have their informed consent, so that's very problematic. And there are also cases of videos on social media which cannot be verified. This opens up a really big question with regards to the visual image of a pandemic in real time this time.
And the other thing we've seen a lot of is people in various places raiding supermarkets. Do you think that panics others into doing that, to sort of think, this is this scary future where what we need to do is go and grab food and hoard it?
Well, this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. We've had for many years movies about pandemics where the image of people looting supermarkets, etc., has been an indispensable kind of part of these movies. And humans are rather mimetic animals, if you like. So there is a danger there that we have created the ground where stockpiling or behaving in such a way in supermarkets is seen as the normal thing to do under an emergency, which actually, if you look at history, that's not the case at all. That's not how people behave in times of epidemics. Usually people come together at time of epidemics. Societies do not fall apart.
And Vivek, what kind of influence do you think it will have had in India, that people may have seen pictures from other parts of the world and seen what's happening and what's going to happen? Has that affected people's behaviour, would you say?
Indeed, I think news from around the world, including pictures, has severely influenced people's views about what is possibly going to happen. if the virus spreads in the country. We have seen images as well as, for example, those pictures circulating on social media, which is so common in India these days. And a number of them can, in fact, mislead also and provide wrong kind of information. So people are quite distressed by those images. Some of them force people's sense of fear and forces them to take appropriate steps which have been advised, such as maintaining social distancing, appropriate hand hygiene, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, sometimes when people are locked down in their own ecosystem and they recycle messages which just reaffirm their own point of view, in that case, it can prove to be perhaps a malign influence as well.
And one of the things people might be looking for is answers, and we have time for just a few more of your questions before the news. Vivek, this one for you. Jeannie Crowson asks, she says, I'm in the elderly with an underlying condition category. Is there any evidence about how people in this group can be treated successfully, or am I to abandon hope if I fall sick with it?
Of course not. I think there are a lot more people in this age group actually survive the COVID infection than succumb to it. So more than 4 out of 5 people over the age of 80 who have this infection will survive. And the right thing for people with this infection is to actually consult a doctor at the right time. The way it can actually kill people is through extensive immune response when the lungs get flooded with fluid and with cells and increasing the body's oxygen supply. So ensuring enough oxygenation in the body, either through initial stages through just oxygen, supplemental oxygen, and later on, if needed, through ventilators, will allow more than 4 out of 5 patients, even above the age of 80, to pull through.
And Lindsay, there's another interesting question here from Anne Shepherd, who says she's 74. She says, a few years ago I was vaccinated against pneumonia. I know this vaccination doesn't protect me from catching the new coronavirus, but what she'd like to know is whether it would protect her from developing pneumonia as a consequence of catching the new coronavirus and therefore reduce her risk of dying from it. What would you say to that, Lindsay?
So there are 2 main types of pneumonia. There's viral pneumonia and then there's bacterial pneumonia. The vaccine that people receive is against bacterial pneumonia, whereas the SARS-CoV-2 virus can cause pneumonia itself, and that's a viral type of pneumonia. So while the vaccine won't prevent you from developing pneumonia caused by this virus, what it can do is prevent you getting a secondary bacterial infection of the type of bacteria that you're vaccinated against. And that is incredibly important because secondary bacterial infections is the risk of people having severe disease and dying from this. So if you're able to get a pneumococcal vaccine, your pneumonia vaccine, I would encourage everyone to do that if they're recommended for it. It also takes added strain off the health services because they do not need to be dealing with pneumonia cases that could have been prevented at a time when really all resources need to be focused on COVID-19 cases.
And so this secondary pneumonia would also be the reason why some people who are being treated are being given antibiotics, even though we know antibiotics only work against bacteria and not against viruses.
Yes, absolutely. There are some bacteria that will just take advantage of the situation of someone that is ill, and they will infect you in addition to being infected with the virus. And that does seem to prove to be much more fatal than the virus itself.
And Vivek, here's a question for you. This is from Edoardo Brunetti from Rome in Italy. And he says, Italy and Japan both have high numbers of older people, and yet Japan has had far fewer deaths than Italy. Do we know why that is?
Well, that's an interesting question. Everyone is trying to figure out why people in some countries have done better than people in some other countries. In Japan, the general wisdom is that it is because of their society and the way people behave with each other. So already there is a fair amount of, you can say, social distancing that takes place in Japan. And people don't have habits of, for example, shaking hands. They bow to each other. And so it is felt that that might have been responsible in limiting the spread of infection.
Well, thank you for all those questions, and thank you for the moment to Vivek Jar, Lindsay Broadbent and Christos Linteris. Now, after the news, we'll find out more about testing for the virus and why it's proving a sticking point for so many governments, and how best to trial new drugs to see whether they work. I'm Claudia Hammond. Do join me for the second part of The Evidence from the BBC.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where World Book Club continues a year-long celebration of female writers.
Fatima Bhutto joins me to talk about her novel The Shadow of the Crescent Moon.
One of the questions of the book, is it a question of who uses violence? Does it become acceptable if the right people or if the right causes are upheld by violence? In my view, no.
Set against the backdrop of Pakistan's war on terror, The Shadow of the Crescent Moon explores the devastating consequences experienced by a younger generation wrecked by fundamentalism.
Essential to my novel is the struggle of women. Millions of women in South Asia, not just Pakistan, suffer the oppression of so many forces, but they struggle and they fight back. This is a region of warriors. You have to be a warrior to be a woman in Pakistan to survive.
Harriet Gilbert talks to Fatima Bhutto. World Book Club at bbcworldservice.com/World Book Club.
Hello, I'm Claudia Hammond, and in a moment I'll be back with the evidence from the BBC, where we're focusing on the coronavirus. After the news, we'll be discussing whether more testing would make a difference and hearing from Italy about the psychological strains on doctors and nurses caring for the dying. How best to trial new drugs, and now that more people are infected, is the stigma of having COVID-19 changing? Do join me and my panel of very knowledgeable guests for the evidence after the BBC News.
BBC News with Justine Green. A British cabinet minister has insisted that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains in charge despite having been admitted to hospital with persistent symptoms of coronavirus. The Housing Minister Robert Jenrick stressed that the Prime Minister was taken to hospital as a precautionary measure, not as an emergency. Children in parts of Japan have returned to school for the first time in a month, while other schools remain closed amid conflicting views on how to return to normal while limiting the virus. In Tokyo, the number of virus cases has doubled over the past week to more than 1,000. Protesters in Ivory Coast's commercial capital Abidjan have destroyed a coronavirus testing centre that was under construction. Residents of the district of Yopougon complained the centre was being built in a crowded residential area too close to their homes. Tighter restrictions have come into force in Ukraine due to the coronavirus pandemic. People must now wear face masks in public places and are not allowed to use parks unless they're walking a dog. So far, Ukraine has comparatively few confirmed cases of the disease and registered 37 deaths. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has appealed for the prevention of violence against women to be made a key part of the response to the pandemic. Mr. Guterres said restrictions on movement could trap women with abusive partners. In other news, security sources in southern Iraq say several rockets have landed near an area in which foreign oil firms and state-run companies operate. No casualties or damage have been reported at the site, which is west of the city of Basra. Scientists have for the first time been able to work out the age of the world's biggest fish, whale sharks, thanks to an isotope produced by nuclear tests during the Cold War. They've established that they can live up to 100 years and weigh 20 tonnes. BBC News.
Welcome back to the evidence on the BBC World Service with me, Claudia Hammond, where we have a panel of guests who are very knowledgeable about the coronavirus and its impact. They are Vivek Jha, Lindsay Broadbent and Christos Linteris, and they're here to give straightforward answers to some of the questions we've all been wondering about in this strange new world we find ourselves in. In this half of the show, we're going to talk about testing for the virus and the best way of discovering new drugs to treat the infection. But I want for a moment to focus on the psychological toll on doctors and nurses in countries such as Italy, who are trying to save some very sick patients. We were talking earlier about some of the main images linked to the pandemic, and people might have seen pictures of hospitals in Italy overwhelmed with patients and doctors and nurses there with their faces that are red raw from wearing protective masks. Working in such conditions and seeing so many patients die is taking its toll on medical staff. Sara Tossato is a psychiatrist at the University of Verona in northern Italy, which has taken the brunt of cases in the country. She told me about some of the most serious consequences for doctors and nurses.
In Italy, we have some cases of nurses or doctors who have attempted suicide, which is the most serious consequences of psychological distress. To avoid this, our hospital and the majority of hospitals in Italy has organized specific psychological support for healthcare staff.
And are you finding that healthcare staff are taking you and other hospitals up on that offer of psychological support?
Yeah, they can book an appointment to discuss their feeling, their difficulties, and to receive the advice how to cope with the problems. But the staff can ask also advice regarding how they can communicate with the families. And sometimes have also to communicate the bad news of the death.
I see. So will the doctors phone the families to tell them that, or do the families go into the hospital?
Unfortunately, this is very sad. The patient is completely isolated in the hospital. So the communication between the patient and the family is sometimes very difficult. So the nurses and the doctor are very aware and try to do all the best. And sometimes also some people from the general population donate phone or tablet to the hospital to support this kind of communication between the patient and the families. But in other case, the staff should cope with the communication of bad news by phone to the families. And they ask for advice or for support to psychologists or psychiatrists.
And for the medical staff, obviously nurses and doctors are used to stressful situations already, but what is so different about the situation that is facing them each day now when they go to work?
Doctors now have a huge and stressed workload because they spend a lot of hours, 12 or sometimes more, at the hospital taking care of patients. And they are also concerned about being able to infect their loved ones. Some of them have made, for example, the choice to live in a hotel. They have no more the support of their family, so they are stressed for that.
Yes, that must make it harder if they then can't go home and see their families as well.
And also it is stressful because you have also to wear mask and personal protection. And you spend time to change dressing mask between one patient to the other one. And you are concerned that you can be infected.
Yeah, so it's a lot of different things for people to deal with in that situation. And I guess they're having to make difficult life and death decisions as well.
Yes, even if here in Verona, but in a lot of hospitals, we worked very hard to have more beds in the intensive care unit. So we try to give all the patients a possibility to receive the best care.
Now, as Sara Tossato says, staff have been having a really difficult time there in Italy. Christos, have we ever seen such terrible impacts on medical staff in previous epidemics? I'm thinking about SARS maybe, or even going back much further, Spanish flu.
Yes, absolutely. We've seen this in most epidemics and pandemics, such as the third plague pandemic or the flu pandemic of 1918, or indeed SARS in the regions which was where it was very severe and prevalent, such as Hong Kong. It's always the case that doctors, nurses, and health staff would be very, very much in danger, and they are at the forefront of this fight against the pandemic. They're the most important people in this story.
Absolutely. And Vivek, this must be a very dreadful thing for doctors and nurses to live through. Are your colleagues in India watching to see what might be coming down the line to them, watching nervously maybe?
Indeed, there is a great deal of nervousness. People are worried about what might happen to them. This is especially important because the personal protective equipments that might be required in case there is a sudden upsurge in the number of cases is just not there at this particular point of time. So there is clearly a great deal of anxiety, and people are desperately trying to look for measures by which they can protect themselves, including taking recourse to some yet unproven remedies.
What protection do frontline healthcare workers have at the moment?
Well, at this time, they don't have anything apart from what is being provided to them by the healthcare system. In some cases, they have masks and maybe some simple gowns, but they don't have the kind of elaborate personal protective equipments that have been advised. They are being reserved for people in specialized hospitals where COVID-infected patients with more severe infections who are likely to be spreading the virus much more abundantly are going to come. But even there, if the number of cases increases substantially and large number of healthcare workers are forced to be pressed into action, there is a risk of the hospitals running out of these supplies.
Now, of course, having the right equipment to protect themselves is absolutely essential for medical staff. But when it comes to everyone else, I mean, Christos, there's been quite a lot of controversy over the wearing of masks and how good they are in either stopping transmitting the virus to someone else or in not catching it yourself. But I was interested to see in your work that in China and many Asian countries, wearing a mask can be seen as something of a sign of solidarity. How is it viewed?
Well, I think that the mask in China in particular has a very different history from the one in the West. In China, the epidemic mask emerged in 1910 as part of a very, very serious effort against pneumonic plague. It was actually invented in China for that purpose, and then it continued being used across the different regimes that China has seen, all the way to SARS, when it saw a very massive use, especially in Hong Kong, but also in other parts of China. And since 2003, it became kind of an everyday accessory, something you would wear against pollution or dust or the common cold, indeed. Well, the masks that people would wear are not necessarily the best to protect them from viral infections, but the wearing of masks is something which is seen as much more of an everyday thing. And it is, in the context of epidemics, also something which shows that, let's say, society can go on. Right? It is something that shows that although we need to create physical distancing, this is not necessarily social distancing. I think the term social distancing, in fact, is a very, very bad term to describe this. What we need is physical distancing, but we need to maintain social cohesion and social interaction for our societies to continue to work and come out unharmed in a social sense after the end of this epidemic.
Now, Austria has just made it compulsory to wear masks when people go shopping. Lindsay, what do we know about whether this will actually stop the spread, or is it just more of a sense of something that gives you a sense of solidarity, like Christos says?
The evidence behind how protective the normal surgical style masks are is quite uncertain at the minute. And as we discussed, a lot of these infections can be asymptomatic. So in that sense, these masks may provide some protection, but it's incredibly important that people understand that the virus can still stick to the outside of this mask. In fact, there was some recent research that showed viruses can actually survive for up to a week on the surface of surgical masks. So if you're taking those off incorrectly, if you're touching them with your hands and not washing your hands, or if you're reusing these masks often, then you could actually be putting yourself at more risk of infecting yourself.
Now, we have some more questions for you, Lindsay, on the spread of the virus, and these all come from a listener called Tom. And so I thought perhaps we could do them quick fire. You're allowed to answer just yes or no if you want to, but some of them may need more detail. What if you have cuts on your hands? Can you catch the virus through those cuts?
No.
Should you change out of your clothes as soon as you get home and then leave them for several days before touching them again?
This probably isn't necessary for most people. This would be important for people working on the front line. They may want to change their clothes and put them straight into the wash when they get home of a day. But it looks like the virus can only survive for about a day on cloth. So we're probably okay if you're just staying at home, social isolating, and going to the shop occasionally. The chance of you having contaminated clothes is probably very, very small.
And Tom's last two quick questions. Does boiling the virus kill it?
Yes.
And does freezing the virus kill it?
We're unsure of that. It will probably reduce the amount of virus, but in the lab, we actually store viruses in the freezer. Our freezers are much colder than the ones you would have in your house, but that's how we actually preserve virus. So it's probably not going to kill everything if you do freeze something.
Thank you for those, Lindsay. That was very impressive, your quick answers to those. Now, I want to talk about the whole topic of stigma. And Vivek, you've said that in India, even health workers can be stigmatised, even though they're the ones who are trying to help people with all this.
Yes, indeed. There have been some really unusual stories where health workers have been denied accommodation by landlords because people thought that they can potentially bring the infection to their homes and infect people living in that area. This is really something which is real.
Christos, are you surprised that health workers would be stigmatised in this way?
To my knowledge, this is unusual, and I'm thinking, it is stigmatization is very common, but I cannot remember of another historical incident where this would be the place, stigmatizing the health workers or doctors or nurses. That's quite unusual, I think.
What sorts of things are we seeing generally when it comes to stigma in epidemics?
Well, unfortunately, it is very common to stigmatize Chinese people for the reason that xenophobia, which is a pervasive form of racism in the West, has emerged in connection with the fear of epidemics. So this connection of xenophobia with epidemics is not new. It is part of this form of racism from its very beginning. And China was associated with the emergence of diseases, or China was seen as the mother of all diseases, and Chinese people were stigmatized and treated really, really badly, with Chinatowns burned down or demolished in the States, for example, at the beginning of the century as a consequence.
And what about after people recover? I know that after the Ebola virus struck, many people are still stigmatised even after they've recovered. But Christos, I was wondering whether maybe that won't be the case this time because so many people will have had it.
There is a bit of an epistemic uncertainty regarding what happens after you've been infected. And the sooner this is clarified, the better, I think, because a lot of the misinformation or indeed disinformation on the media feed on uncertainty. Now, uncertainty, of course, in science is very important. Science can only progress through uncertainty, but we need to reach some conclusion soon regarding, for example, whether you acquire natural immunity, or there were some stories that people who had recovered manifest symptoms again, so they could possibly spread the disease again. So whether this is true or not has to be clarified very soon, and it has to become public knowledge, not just clarified in the Lancet or in some medical journal. It has to be out there in the media so that people who recover are not stigmatized.
And I guess this brings us to the whole issue of people wanting to know who is safe to be beside or to touch and who is not safe to be beside or to touch. And of course, testing is one of the things that might tell people that. Vivek, we know that if someone gets the symptoms, they are contagious probably for a day or two before they've become ill themselves. Don't we really need to know whether there are some people who are asymptomatic and who are carrying the virus or did carry the virus for a while, even though they never had symptoms? Is that what we need to be able to test for?
Yes, indeed. I think that's really important if we want to break the chain of transmission, because the greatest risk is, as it appears from experience in Italy and in some other places, is from people who are considered to be non-infective because they don't have symptoms yet, and many of them are actually carrying the virus. In fact, one of my Italian colleagues who I was talking to a few days ago said very tellingly fear the COVID negative ward, because that is where you are likely to get your infections most likely.
And Lindsay, when it comes to testing, there are two types of tests, aren't there? One to see if you've got the virus currently, and one that can tell if you've had it in the past. Do we know how accurate generally these tests are or will be?
There has been some debate over the accuracy of the current tests that are available. The test that's used for diagnosis at the minute is a molecular-based test, and we have to be very careful to pick part of the molecular genome of the virus that isn't like any other virus. And as we know, there are other coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS and even the common cold. So we need to make sure we don't have false positives from those. The tests used at the minute in most countries seem to be working very well. There were a few hiccups at the beginning, but that seems to have been sorted out incredibly quickly. The other test you mentioned is very commonly referred to as the antibody test. Now, this won't help us in identifying cases as they become apparent and as people start to develop symptoms, because this relies on your body producing antibodies against the virus. So that can take a few days, if not a couple of weeks, until you can actually use this test to get a reliable result. But what this can be used for is figuring out who has actually had the virus. Those antibodies should hang around in our bodies for quite a while, for a few months at least. And using that, we can then tell who is probably going to be immune to getting this virus again. And therefore, those people could be used to help get essential services back up and running. They might be able to return to work. They could be helping out and volunteering to provide reinforcement to the health services. And it will give us an overall idea of how many people in total were actually infected and how many of those people were completely asymptomatic.
Well, we have a question on that actually from Gary Abirami, who'd read about plans in Germany to test people and then issue immunity certificates so that they could start working again and being useful. And she says she can't imagine this happening in India with a population of 1.3 billion and wonders how a lockdown could ever be lifted in India for life to go back to normal. Vivek, what would you say to that? Could testing be a part of this in India?
So testing is essential. We are not going to be able to really be able to answer this question that is so important right now. That's the uppermost question in everyone's mind as to what do we do after the lockdown ends. And the only answer that every public health expert comes up with is that we have to keep testing more people. There have been some signs that in recent days, government has ramped up the testing capability, and with the availability of the new antibody test, possibly it might become easy to test large number of people in relatively short spans of time and get results relatively quickly. So that should help.
And modelling in New Zealand suggests that even if you lock down for 400 days, so that's more than a year, 400 days, that as soon as you opened up again, the virus would start to spread. So it's quite hard to see how you can ever lift these things. Lindsay, what would you say to that?
Yes, the timing of removing restrictions is really important. If we look at the 1918 influenza pandemic that occurred in 2 cities in America, the restrictions were lifted 2 weeks earlier in one city, and they saw a massive second peak of infections. In another city that lengthened the time of social distancing and isolation, they did not see that second peak reach the same levels. So we really have to be careful about when we decide to loosen some of the restrictions in place. And I think at the minute, everyone's keeping a really close eye on what's happening in China and specifically in Wuhan, because that'll give us a fantastic idea of what is likely to occur in other countries around the world.
And we talked about these two different kinds of tests. Vivek, which of these two tests would you say is more pressing for somewhere like India? The one to diagnose whether people have it in the first place, or to get that antibody test ready for everybody to be able to have that?
I think for screening of large number of people relatively quickly and get results that are going to be informative so far as public health policy is concerned, it is the latter, the antibody test. However, for an individual who has potential infection and wants to find out whether they have coronavirus or not, it is the first test that is going to be more useful for that particular individual.
Now, the other big hopes, of course, for putting an end to all this are, of course, a vaccine, which we know would take at least a year to develop if we're lucky, or successful treatments. Lindsay, you've just got a grant to screen existing drugs and then test the most promising ones in the lab. When you're screening them, what are you looking for? How do you tell whether it's something that might work?
So initially, we will be screening over 1,000 drugs, and we will quite simply be looking to see if these drugs help the survival of the infected cells. So we will infect cells with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, then we will treat with the drug and figure
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire,
even if you feel you were wronged, they may, for whatever reason, quite literally no longer have a need. That is really a challenge. That's why I will certainly suggest reaching out in a way that includes empathy for them, what you think they probably are sitting with, and then your intention that you would like to perhaps look at revisiting, just to reconnect, whatever it is.
Yeah, and manage your expectations. You may do enormous work on yourself to reach out. Lots of thinking, processing of emotion, chatting to a third party, deciding on balance it's the right thing to do, and still there are no guarantees. The fact that you have virtuous intentions and your words are carefully crafted does not mean that the other party owe you anything. They have their own version and their own needs.
Indeed, and after you may reach out, sometimes they will have an impact on that side, and it may take a little while to process it too. They may not be ready to reach out today, but if one does it with that grace and that empathy, you might find in a month they reach back out and say, sure, I've been thinking a lot about the way that you reached out to me. And there you've got the potential to heal.
Absolutely. We've run out of time, Hayden. Brilliant as always. Thank you so much for your excellence.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And I realize this lockdown is so unique on our psychology. I'm trying to release daily videos of the psychology behind lockdown to really assist people, for anyone that's interested.
That's Hayden Nibbs, clinical psychologist, and an excellent one at that. And we're grateful to have you as one of our regulars. Thanks, Hayden.
Movie night is the best night of the week for my family. Each one gets a turn to choose which movie we must all watch. I choose HOSMED Access for my family because I know that it caters for all our basic healthcare needs, just like this movie. If your color is green, HOSMED Access is for you.
That's right. HOSMED Medical Aid is about choice. # what's your color?
Get the access plan. Call 0860 000048 now.
At African Bank, we say yes to your dreams, yes to investing in your goals, and yes to giving you the best with a personalized loan of up to 250,000 Rand. Visit us at africanbank.co.za and get the full online experience where you could get your loan at your convenience any time of the day, or SMS easy to 30963 and we'll call you back. African Bank. We are you. African Bank is an authorized FSP and registered credit provider. T's and C's apply.
Planning an event, M-Star Productions is a preferred technical solutions provider for corporate events, roadshows, award dinners, and exhibitions. With state-of-the-art technology and equipment and an experienced events and technical team, they're able to cater for all event types and sizes, and they'll meet your requirements. Visit mstar.co.za, that's M-Star with a double R, and use the promo code RADIO to receive a 15% discount for your next event. M-Star, enhancing brands through innovation and technology. A level 1 BEE contributor. It's just gone noon. Here's the latest in Eyewitness News.
This is Eyewitness News.
Good afternoon, I'm Ayanda Nyati. President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on the international community to demonstrate its commitment to supporting developing economies on the African continent by assisting with the various responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. In his weekly newsletter, Ramaphosa has detailed the plans of the African Union. However, these are being sculpted by severe shortages of coronavirus test kits, medicine, face masks, and other protective equipment. Teto Matlakwana takes a look.
While Cyril Ramaphosa acknowledges that every continent is affected by the COVID-19 outbreak, he has emphasized that Africa's weak health systems and challenges such as poverty make it more vulnerable to the pandemic. In the same breath, he goes on to affirm that there are some countries on the continent that have wide-ranging and extensive experience in managing infectious disease outbreaks and epidemics, which will work to our advantage. The recently established African Union COVID-19 Response Fund has garnered $12.5 million in commitments from various member states, with the African Center for Disease Control receiving an additional $4.5 million. Ramaphosa is chair of the AU and has recently convened a meeting with the African Union Bureau, where it was agreed that regional task forces would be set up in all 5 regions. These will oversee screening, detection, diagnosis, infection prevention and control, among other functions. While the continent was among the last to be affected by the virus, the accelerating rate of its spread has been a cause of major concern, with the death toll confirmed at over 300 people and confirmed cases well past the 8,000 mark. Teto Matlakwana, Eyewitness News in Johannesburg.
With over 17,000 people arrested for flouting lockdown regulations, police say they need the entire country to comply with the laws and not only the majority. A 23-year-old Centurion man is expected to appear in the Pretoria Magistrates Court today for defying the lockdown rules. In a video widely circulated on social media, the man can be seen bragging about not staying indoors and stopping at what appears to be the Littleton police station before teasing the officers there. The police's Vish Naidu has called on South Africans to take the regulations seriously.
I don't think majority is going to do it for us. We need 100% compliant, especially when dealing with a virus such as this. This is a communicable disease. This is a disease that it can take just a few people to spread. So we needed 100% compliant.
Meanwhile, former Constitutional Court Justice Kate O'Regan says she now has to balance helping government protect people's privacy with the state's urgency to stop the spread of COVID-19. O'Regan has been appointed as a designated judge to make sure that as government uses people's personal information to trace COVID-19 transmissions, their privacy is not compromised. Government is now instructing mobile operators to help with information to track down unknown people who might have been in contact with someone who's tested positive for the disease. Many have raised concerns about the possibility of undue surveillance from the state. Speaking on the Eusebius Makaza show earlier, O'Regan says a thin line has to be tread not to violate people's privacy.
Government has made very clear provision for the destruction of this information at the end of the state of disaster period. In other words, once government considers that the risk of COVID-19 has diminished, then this information will be destroyed, and that is something that the Department of Health must report both to me and to Parliament on as to what steps have been taken to do that.
And United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is calling on governments around the world to prevent violence against women and children during the COVID-19 lockdown. He says he's extending his call for peace in war zones to include safety in what he calls people zones. Jean-Jacques Cornish has more.
The COVID-19 pandemic is daily presenting shocking statistics. UN boss Antonio Guterres says another involves women and children facing the largest threat where they should be safest, at home. Guterres says governments must increase investment in online and civil society support for threatened women. Judicial systems must continue to prosecute abusers. Emergency warnings must be placed at pharmacies and grocery stores. And women should have safe ways of seeking support without alerting their abusers. Jean-Jacques Cornish, Eyewitness News.
Let's take a look at developments elsewhere in the world. The Colombian government is calling for solidarity and support for more than 1 million Venezuelan migrants who've been hit hard by the impacts of the coronavirus. About 600 Venezuelan citizens crossed the Colombian border into Venezuela this weekend. Colombia's quarantine measures during the outbreak have left many Venezuelan citizens in the country without a source of income.
And Switzerland has reported more than 800 cases of COVID-19 in just 24 hours, bringing the national total number of known infections in that country to 21,000. At least 559 people have died from the virus. Globally, 1.2 million people have contracted the disease, while more than 226,000 have recovered. More than 69,000 others have now died. For the very latest on the COVID-19 pandemic, stay tuned to Eyewitness News. Otherwise, simply hit ewn.co.za. Gold's trading at $1,633.70 an ounce. The rand's 18.88 to the dollar, 23.20 to the pound, 20.40 to the euro. Brent crude oil's at $33.12 a barrel.
And in the traffic, we're seeing slow movements on the M2. This is in the Selby area, both ways, between Main Reef Road and the Crown Interchange, while in Bedford View, there's a car stuck on the road on the N3 South just after the Gululis Interchange. Approach with care.
It's a partly cloudy day in Gauteng. The temperatures have peaked at highs of 26 and 28 degrees. The top story in Eyewitness News this hour. President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on the international community to demonstrate its commitment to supporting developing economies on the African continent by assisting with the responses to the COVID-19 crisis.
Eyewitness News. In touch, in tune, and independent. For the latest, visit ewn.mobi.
What you need to know about the coronavirus
on the 702 app,
on 702.co.za,
and on 702.
702 on 92.7
and 106 FM.
Streaming on 702.co.za, the 702 app, and on DSTV channel 856.
7 minutes after 12, Dumelang, good afternoon. You're on 702 and Cape Talk on this Monday afternoon. I'm Clement Manyatela with you until 1 p.m. We're looking at all the important news you need to know about regarding COVID-19 this afternoon. So coming up, a 23-year-old man appears in court today for defying the lockdown regulations. The SAPS will chat to us about that. And then we'll focus on the stigma that is attached to COVID-19. People have tested positive and they're being ostracized by communities. We'll chat about the dangers of really people stigmatizing those that have tested positive for COVID-19 and look at government's education programs about the virus. Is it trickling down to communities? Also, what do South Africans think about government's response to COVID-19? Well, Ipsos has done a poll and they'll come and chat to us about their findings. Plus, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in hospital. We're live in London for an update. All of this and more in this hour. You can connect and engage with us on 011-883-0702 in Cape Town, 021-446-0567. You can also send your WhatsApp voice notes to 072-702-1702. Our SMS lines are 31702 and 31567.
702 for the curious.
Streaming countrywide on the 702 app.
All right, let's start with the latest numbers regarding COVID-19. There are now 1,655 confirmed cases in the country. This is an increase of 70 cases from what was reported on Saturday. So far, 11 people have died from the virus and COVID-19 related complications. Over 56,000 people have been tested in the country. And we know that house-to-house screening and testing has begun on Saturday in KwaZulu-Natal. And it will continue to be rolled out throughout the country. So as of when we look at the entire continent, there are now 7,800 confirmed cases of the virus in nearly 50 African countries.
Connect.
Engage.
Change.
This is 702.
This is 702.
For the curious.
By the way, did you watch